Fluent Flow Podcast, Episode 60, The Psychology of People Who Love Staying at Home.
Welcome to the debate. Today, we are analyzing the psychological drivers behind a deep preference for staying at home, this phenomenon often labeled the homebody. Our material seems to illuminate this choice not as a deficit, but as a deliberate, almost intentional pathway to fulfillment. So the central question that emerges from this is whether this profound reliance on the domestic environment is primarily an expression of internal strength and, let's say, superior self-management, or if it functions chiefly as a sophisticated psychological defense mechanism, a way to mitigate emotional and sensory overload from the world.
That's a very accurate framing of the tension. My position, I have to say, leans toward that latter interpretation. While the outcomes, creativity, introspection are undeniably positive, I would argue that the intensity of this preference is often rooted in a kind of vulnerability. It is a necessary, albeit successful, strategy for minimizing exposure to unpredictable variables that have, in the past, proven painful or overwhelming. The home is utilized as a low-threat environment not just for comfort, but for essential recovery. And that suggests the entire mechanism is fundamentally reactive.
I see why you emphasize the reactive component. I do. But I believe that framing sort of reduces the agency and, frankly, the wisdom of the individual. My position is that this preference for the home environment is a proactive, strategic choice. It reflects a highly developed self-awareness and a commitment to optimizing one's own energy. These individuals possess a remarkable high internal self-presence. Their inner world of ideas, imagination, and emotional processing is just intensely active and fulfilling. They're not retreating from the world. They are intentionally positioning themselves for maximum creative output and an authentic existence.
That is a compelling statement about internal richness. You're right. Yet it doesn't fully account for the profound necessity of environmental control that the material repeatedly highlights. If this were purely about that internal richness, the need for such rigid boundaries, predictability of space, of sound, of light, it would be less critical. The fact that chaos or high stimulus can feel like a, quote, flood, it suggests a physiological component, a high sensitivity to external stimuli. So this isn't mere preference, it's the nervous system demanding balance. The need for a controlled environment is, I think, an adaptation designed to reduce the chronic stress hormone cortisol, which is a necessary act of survival, not just intellectual optimization.
Oh, I agree entirely that sensory processing differences are central to this. But I would argue that recognizing one's physiological needs and then restructuring one's entire existence to meet them is the pinnacle of emotional maturity, not just mitigation. This shifts the focus from, avoiding pain to maximizing function. Consider the analogy of a high-performance athlete. They maintain a strict, controlled regimen, rest, diet, recovery, not because they fear the playing field, but because they understand what their highly attuned system requires to perform at its peak. The homebody sanctuary is that recovery regimen. It transforms potential psychological distress into sustained creative capability.
That's an interesting pivot, framing it as a strategy of excellence. However, if we accept the premise of high sensitivity leading to this intense emotional decompression, that very real need to immediately shed the mask and just lie down upon entering the home, we have to ask why that initial draining occurs so severely in the first place. I would contend it's because of a consistent feeling that their authentic self, that vivid high internal world you describe, is not safely accommodated or validated externally. So the reliance on home for dropping the armor implies that the outside world is consistently experienced as a psychological battlefield. If the choice is rooted in historical disappointment, then the function of the home is fundamentally restorative. It's repairing the damage rather than just fueling future engagement.
But doesn't the ability to choose where and how that energy is restored demonstrate the strength? They're not passively overwhelmed. They are actively managing their resources. Furthermore, the material links this solitude to superior emotional intelligence. To process external input so intensely allows them to be exceptionally attuned to nuance and deeper meanings. They retreat in order to synthesize this intense data. And this process, this introspection, allows them to sit with complicated feelings, transforming sensory input into a very complex understanding. They are not running from their emotions. They are committing to understanding them fully, which is a practice the busy world often forbids.
Right, but I'm not convinced that intentionality alone negates the defensive origin of it all. Let's consider the long-term consequences of this intense need for a controlled environment. While yes, predictability reduces acute anxiety and allows for productivity, an excessive reliance on control can limit one's capacity for adaptive flexibility. If one's peace is so highly contingent on the familiar, what happens when life inevitably throws a variable that can't be managed within those four walls? The need for control then becomes a psychological barrier that may impede emotional resilience in uncontrolled settings. It could potentially foster what the material calls a guarded heart that gives trust very slowly. The strategy is successful, sure, but it risks ossifying the individual's comfort zone.
Well, that brings us right back to the distinction between chosen solitude and unchosen loneliness. The homebody chooses solitude because they recognize the richness of self-companionship. They feel whole when they are alone. And this self-sufficiency, it acts as a profound buffer against needing external validation or being defined by external circumstances. The guardedness that you observe, rather than being a limitation, might actually be a highly efficient filtering mechanism. They seek authentic connections, relationships built on depth, loyalty, and real emotional honesty, and they filter out the superficial engagements that drain their energy without providing any meaning. This selective engagement, in the end, maximizes the quality of their social life.
But if we accept that premise of high sensitivity, the difficulty is that this depth often comes at the cost of a pervasive emotional resonance. Highly sensitive individuals, they tend to absorb the moods and anxieties of others like a sponge. So when they engage authentically, they're investing a massive amount of psychic energy, which necessitates the retreat. The home is therefore the necessary decompression chamber from the intensity of other people's emotional worlds. I mean, if we look at the data on childhood emotional environments for these types of individuals, there's often a history of feeling burdened or having their own feelings dismissed. The intensity of the preference, therefore, strongly suggests an attempt to create the emotional safety that was previously absent.
I appreciate the necessity of viewing this through a lens of psychological history, I do, but that risks reducing current strength to a past deficit. We have to focus on the function now, and the current function is transformative. They use their quiet productivity to generate new insights. Consider the concept of the quiet ritual. Journaling, deep reading, meticulous organization. These are methods of establishing an internal order that directly foster creativity and complex problem solving. These activities are evidence that the choice to stay home isn't stagnation, it's preparation. They are organizing their internal landscape so they can emerge with clarity. That is profoundly different from merely hiding.
But the preparation, however brilliant the output, is predicated on the exclusion of uncontrolled stimuli. This raises a challenge regarding the development of robust psychological tolerance. We know that resilience is often built by gradually exposing oneself to manageable stress. If the environment is consistently engineered to eliminate stress, are they really developing the full spectrum of emotional tools they need to navigate profound life crises that can't be handled by retreating? I would posit that while the home fosters high emotional intelligence regarding internal states, it might inadvertently stunt the development of grit and flexibility required for sustained engagement with the inherent unpredictability of the world.
That assumes that the homebody is perpetually static, though. We have to remember that introspection is a dynamic process. By cultivating high self-awareness, they are better equipped to identify their own thresholds and limitations. So when they do step out, their engagement is targeted, it's intentional, and it minimizes wasted effort. That's efficiency, not weakness. Furthermore, the capacity for solitude itself is a demonstration of immense psychological strength. It requires confronting oneself without distraction, which many people actively avoid through constant external stimulation. The person who thrives in stillness has mastered a foundational aspect of self-control that the constantly busy often miss.
I agree that the capacity for self-confrontation in stillness is powerful. I do. However, let's return to the idea of the raw, unfiltered version of the self that the home accommodates. The ability to drop the mask is essential for mental health. But my question is, why is the mask so necessary outside? It's because the highly sensitive person experiences the pressure to perform, to meet social expectations, to manage the intensity of external data as utterly exhausting. The depth of the preference for home is directly proportional to the perceived threat level of the outside world. It is the intensity of the reaction, that need for immediate cortisol reduction, that suggests defense, even if the result is positive creation.
Or perhaps the mask isn't just about protection, but about effective communication in a noisy environment. The homebody understands that their internal richness is often too complex for casual, fast-paced interactions. The external world demands compression, simplicity. They retreat to the sanctuary to restore the fidelity of their authentic self, ensuring that when they do communicate, it's genuine and meaningful, rather than, a diluted performance. This focus on maximizing the quality of engagement over the quantity of presence indicates a high degree of discernment, which I still equate with strength. They are not avoiding society, they are defining the terms of their engagement with it.
And I would maintain that those terms are defined by the perceived threat level. The higher the sensitivity, the stricter the terms of engagement must be. This is a functional outcome of having been overstimulated. If the choice is always framed as, I can only operate optimally when the environment conforms to my needs, it establishes a dependency on external conditions for internal peace. True strength, I would argue, is the ability to maintain internal peace despite external turbulence. The homebody has found a successful coping strategy, yes, but it is one that relies heavily on architectural and environmental boundaries to sustain that internal clarity.
So the strength, then, is defining a peace that no external force can truly eradicate. By building it meticulously within their immediate sphere of influence, they've achieved autonomy over their emotional landscape.
And the paradox is that this autonomy might be contingent on a boundary that limits their adaptability to chaos. What we have is a highly successful method of coping, driven by sensitivity.
Exactly. So we've explored whether the deep preference for staying at home is primarily an expression of internal strength, a proactive choice towards superior energy management and fulfillment, or if it functions mainly as a necessary defense mechanism against high sensitivity and the demand for constant emotional decompression.
Yes, and the material strongly supports the necessity of this refuge. The intensity of the need for a low-threat environment and stringent control. It all points toward a strategy rooted in protection and recovery from what feels like an overwhelming world. The resulting productivity is the successful outcome of this necessary defense.
And I still contend that the wisdom lies in transforming that necessity into an intentional lifestyle, leveraging stillness and introspection to achieve sustained self-awareness and deep, authentic connection. This demonstrates not just recovery, but a higher form of living.
The depth of this material, I think, lies in acknowledging that these two interpretations are very likely interwoven. Thank you for this rigorous discussion.
There's always more complexity to uncover in the psychology of intentional living. Until next time.